Okay, so I hope you can all hear me. I've got a bit of a cold, so I'm hoping my voice lasts until the end of the talk, and I apologize in advance if I cough or sneeze. So let's get straight into it. So basically, one of the things I wanted to do with this talk was to start to clarify the concepts around entity encounter experiences. How can we talk about this sensibly in academic philosophy of psychedelics? And in the recent publications in philosophy of psychedelics, there's a lot of discussion of mystical experience. We find a lot of discussions of mystical or unitive experiences, and the people who are often quoted or referred to with reference to this are Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts, whose ideas about mystical experience had a big impact on the psychedelic discourse. And so we can sort of think of them as the originators of, let's say, psychedelic mysticism. And the thing about Watts and Huxley, they encountered psychedelics relatively late in their lives, and they framed it in terms of the Eastern mystical traditions that they studied. And the kind of culmination, let's say, of the ideas of psychedelic mysticism are kind of encapsulated in this book, The Psychedelic Experience, written by Tim Leary, Richard Alpert, and Ralph Metzner, which is a manual for programming psychedelic experience according to the model of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, to have a mystical unitive experience, and describes a mystical or unitive experience in this kind of, let's say, classical characterization, an experience of complete transcendence beyond words, beyond space-time, beyond self. There's no visions, no sense of self, no thoughts, only pure awareness and ecstatic freedom. So we have this account of a classical unitive mystical experience. But we could broadly categorize religious experiences in such a way where, yes, we can talk about unitive mystical experiences, which are void of content, which people say is union with God or union with the white light, where, from a phenomenological point of view, the subject-object division in consciousness is transcended. But that's not the only type of religious experience we hear about in religious traditions. There's what you might call a relational type of religious experience. The prophetic traditions or magical or shamanic traditions often talk about visionary experiences, where the visionary content is held to be valuable. Now, this is in stark contrast to mystical traditions, where often, not always, but often, visions are seen as karmic hallucinations or illusions to be overcome, or distractions from complete transcendence. Because for a unitive experience, there must be no sense of self. But for a relational visionary experience, there actually is this sense of self. And the subject-object division remains. And what the subject does is encounters a transcendent other as the object. So there's a big difference between these types of experience. And now, at least anecdotally, we can say that the unitive mystical experience is often associated with 5-MeO-DMT, and the relational visionary experience is often associated with NN-DMT. Now, I am not at all suggesting that this is a hard and fast rule, or that one does one and the other doesn't. I'm just saying, anecdotally, these are associated in that way. Now, it's interesting, inhaled NN-DMT has been shown repeatedly to have this tendency to produce these entity encounter experiences. In a survey of over 2,500 experiences, nearly half of those experiences involved entity encounters. And when Dr. Rick Strassman in the early 90s, in the beginning of the resurgence of psychedelic research, he administered DMT to his volunteers. Now, Strassman was involved in Zen Buddhism, and he was influenced by the psychedelic mysticism that I just mentioned. So he expected his volunteers to return with descriptions of mystical, unitive experiences, void of content, union with the white light. And that is not at all what they reported. They started talking about entities, insects, reptilians, alien figures. They experienced a parallel level of reality that was at least as real, or some of them said more real than this one, as opposed to a level of reality whose essential nature was empty of content. And Strassman said the yardstick of a unitive mystical state was just simply inapplicable. And in fact, when he engaged with his volunteers in such a way where he treated these visionary experiences as, let's say, illusions or hallucinations in the way of complete transcendence, he found that this alienated him from the volunteers, for whom the experiences were very, very meaningful, and they didn't want to dismiss it as an illusion. And if we look at the indigenous psychedelic plant traditions, the ancient traditions that go back thousands of years, they actually place a great value on interactions with entities, plant spirits. And they have an animistic worldview, and the engagement with non-human intelligences of nature is a crucial part of these traditions. So I think it's important for us to speak and begin to get a clear way to discuss these entity encounter experiences, or this encounter with the transcendent other. Now, one figure who spent a lot of time engaging with the intellectual challenges of entity encounter experiences was Terence McKenna. Now, I always do this when I do a talk on McKenna. Anyone here a fan of Terence McKenna? Willing to admit it? Nice. Oh, okay, thank you. That's good to see. So anyone who doesn't know, Terence McKenna was an American ethnobotanist, sometimes considered the psychedelic bard of the 1980s and 90s. He went around doing talks on psychedelics. He proposed the so-called stoned ape theory of human evolution, that the use of psychedelic mushrooms played a role in human evolution. He popularized the so-called heroic dose of psilocybin, 5 dry grams in silent darkness. And he popularized the practice of smoking DMT, which until then was a very niche, very underground practice. Now, I'm not going to say much more about McKenna's biography or his ideas, apart from specific ones, but if you're really interested in knowing more about McKenna, or you're a fan and like to get more details, The Strange Attractor, a biography of Terence McKenna, has just been published, and Graham St. John wrote it. It looks amazing, so if you're interested and want to know more, I strongly recommend checking this out. But I would like to bring McKenna as a figure which we can engage with in philosophy of psychedelics and academic philosophy as much as, or I would say even more so than Huxley or Watts. Now, if anyone wants to challenge me on this or doesn't agree with this, feel free, we can discuss this afterwards. I'm not going to get into the reasons why I think he's such a good figure, but I'm at least going to say, under the umbrella of what Aidan Leon has called psychedelic philosophy, psychedelic philosophy as opposed to philosophy of psychedelics, I think we can talk about McKenna as a psychedelic philosopher in this sense, where psychedelic philosophy is not just philosophy about psychedelics, but philosophy which is informed by psychedelic experiences, informed by psychedelic practices. Now, the phrase psychedelic here is meant in the etymological sense of mind-revealing, and so it could be a drug or a substance, but it could also be a practice like meditation, anything that brings into consciousness something that was previously hidden. But importantly, these psychedelic methods, which are more powerful than analytic methods at revealing the mind, they aren't perfectly reliable, and so they must be kept in check by analytic methods. So it's basically an idea of conducting philosophy, but using these psychedelic instruments or tools or methods as an adjunct, let's say. And this is how McKenna essentially saw himself. McKenna said, I am a rationalist who's just had a very weird set of experiences, but I am a rationalist. Now, that might be surprising to some people, and anyone who's familiar with McKenna knows that McKenna used what you might call particularly colorful metaphors to describe his psychedelic experiences, and probably the most famous one, and the one that gets, shall we say, a relative disdain from certain people in the research community, is the idea of self-transforming elf machines from hyperspace, right? So McKenna said things like, elf legions await in hyperspace, one toke away. Now, I'm not going to get into the exact details of this, but I've argued that McKenna is not giving a literal description, or at least it's not primarily to be intended as a literal description of ontological status of these entities. He's actually, if you look at McKenna's discourse, he is trying to emphasize the weirdness of DMT. And if you look at how McKenna uses language and how he talks about how he uses language, he's very explicit about this. McKenna is not philosophically naive. He's interested in the phenomenon of the weirdness of DMT, characterized by these entity encounters. So McKenna will say stuff like, if flying saucers were to land on the south lawn of the White House tomorrow, it wouldn't change the fact that DMT is the weirdest thing in the universe, okay? He says things like, sometimes people say, is DMT dangerous? It sounds so crazy. Is it dangerous? He says the answer is only if you fear death by astonishment. Okay, so the fact that this is so weird is the crucial thing. It is not about little elf machines. For McKenna, it's almost like it's the limit case of the imagination. He says that psychedelics transcended any miracle he could have ever asked for, because it not only had the quality of a miracle as he imagined it, it had the quality of a miracle as he could not have imagined it. It was beyond what he possibly could have imagined. He uses phrases adapted from Haldane, stranger than we can suppose. He says that the experience of DMT and the entity encounter is simultaneously so affirming and at the same time so paradigm shattering. And when he talks about alien intelligence and stuff like that, I just realized my phone is making noises, sorry. He says, I think it's something so bizarre that it actually masquerades as an extraterrestrial so as not to alarm us by the true implications of what it is, right? So this is about, it's not just that this is an experience so weird that you can't imagine it. You can't even imagine that something could be so weird. You can't even imagine the weirdness, right? So it's very important to understand he's creating metaphors for something that's not just the other, it's ineffably other. The other is not just ineffable, but how other it is ineffable. He says, no matter how weird I say it is, no matter what scintillating metaphor I create to attempt to beguile you into imagining what you can't imagine. That's the key. Trick you into imagining what you can't imagine. I'm perfectly aware that I'm falling short of the goal. I'm creating a symbol for what it is, but frankly, words fail. So anyone who wants to criticize McKenna or laugh at McKenna for self-transforming elf machines from hyperspace, you got to engage with that first. So, deriving these, this characterization of these experiences from McKenna, I want to return to the ideas from this book, The Psychedelic Experience Revealing the Mind, which I think is a superb work of philosophy. There's this idea of psychedelic space, or 4 dimensions by which we can talk about how psychedelic or how mind-revealing an experience is. So an experience can be more revealing of the mind and therefore more psychedelic if it reveals more of the mind. That's the dimension of scope. If it reveals the mind more clearly, that's the dimension of clarity. If it reveals parts of the mind that are more deeply buried in the unconscious, that's the dimension of novelty. Or if it reveals the mind for a greater amount of time, that's the dimension of duration. So I want to emphasize and kind of zoom in on this notion of novelty, which anyone who's a fan of McKenna will know. McKenna had essentially a metaphysics called novelty theory. So novelty is a really important thing for McKenna. So I think one way we can start to frame psychedelic experiences that involve these entity encounters or encounters with the transcendent other is in terms of the psychedelic space and in terms of the dimension of novelty. And I would suggest, at least tentatively, that the experience with the transcendent other could be considered an experience of maximal novelty, at least relative to that person's, let's say, origin in psychedelic space or their normal consciousness prior to the experience. And McKenna, in fact, even draws the distinction between the mystical-unitive experience and the relational experience. McKenna says, union with the white light you could handle. An invasion of your apartment by dual self-driveling basketballs from hyperspace that are speaking in demonic Greek is not something you anticipated or could handle, right? So he is emphasizing that this is beyond what you could ever have imagined. This is such a novel experience, even more novel than union with the white light. And so I'd also like to highlight that the idea of novelty actually implies relation, right? So here we have the unitive union with the white light, and we have this relational engagement with entities. But the very notion of novelty is a relational concept. Something is novel with respect to something else. It's a relation between two things. It's fundamentally a dualistic concept. So to me, it kind of makes sense then that an experience characterized by maximal novelty would have a relational component, or could be understood as a relational experience. And we also have this notion that maximal novelty is paradigm shattering. McKenna's phrase, it's simultaneously so affirming and at the same time so paradigm shattering. Now, for the mathematical logicians or people who like this kind of thing, I would say this, maybe we could consider this analogous to a Gödel sentence. For those who don't like logic, what I mean is basically you have an experience, something happens. It doesn't contradict your previous worldview. It doesn't say that everything you thought before is not true. It's consistent with it, but you've just discovered that there was a massive piece missing. Something was incomplete. In other words, you didn't know, perhaps, that there's this other realm where other entities or non-human intelligences exist. So why is this important? So to ground this then in the theme of this conference, which is challenging psychedelics, a paradigm-shattering experience can be a very challenging experience. A recent survey of kind of difficult psychedelic experiences suggests that psychedelic-induced ontological shock can lead to cognitive, emotional, and social ungrounding, which can in turn lead to prolonged existential confusion and challenges with meaning making. So I actually think that this raises ethical questions about psychedelically naive therapists or clinicians administering a compound which could potentially be paradigm shattering for a person. Because if it's, by definition beyond what can be imagined, that therapist is not in a position to kind of help that person through it. And this paper also found that successful integration of these ontological challenges requires re-establishing stability and meaning for individuals to be able to rebuild frameworks for their understanding of the world and of their existential identity. And again, if the clinician or the person, the therapist administering this doesn't have that kind of experience, they arguably aren't really equipped to kind of help a person rebuild meaning in this way. And furthermore, these are the kind of experiences that challenge the worldview of the individual who goes through them, but they also challenge the worldview of the culture in which that person is, in which that therapy or trial takes place. And most respondents who had these entity encounters, they endorsed that the entity had the attribute of being conscious, intelligent, and benevolent, real in some other dimension, and continue to exist after the encounter. Now that's a radical conclusion for people to come to, especially when you consider the fact that more than half of those who identified as atheist before the experience no longer identified as atheist afterwards. And the experiences were rated as the most meaningful, or among the most meaningful, spiritual, and psychologically insightful experiences of their life, and resulted in persisting positive changes in life satisfaction, purpose, and meaning. So not only are these potentially paradigm-shattering experiences that could lead to ontological shock, that require very careful integration and a very deliberate attempt to rebuild meaning, but if it's done correctly, it can actually really help a person and improve their lives. And so just to bring it back and kind of tie it back to the contrast between the mystical unitive experience that I characterized at the beginning, one of the things about mystical unitive experiences is that they often characterize experience or the world as an illusion, as something to be transcended, and kind of a distraction from complete transcendence. Now that is a little bit, shall we say, ethically fraught from a social point of view, right? And can often lead to solipsism, or the idea that all that exists is my mind. In contrast, these entity encounters shift away from that solipsistic worldview and emphasize a kind of symbiotic worldview, one where human intelligence is actually in a relationship with other forms of non-human intelligence, and it's essential for human intelligence to engage with that for their survival, essentially. So that's kind of all I have to say about that. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks.
Entities in the audience have any questions and comments? There, Markus.
I wonder whether there's some connection between the entity experiences with psychedelics to the entity experiences related to sleep paralysis. So in sleep paralysis, people also experience those kind of usually malevolent entities that are sort of present in the room or sitting on your chest or something like that, keeping you down in sleep paralysis. Do you know anything about that?
That's really interesting. So I know that often we're not supposed to speak about personal psychedelic experiences at conferences, but I can speak about my personal sleep paralysis experiences because that doesn't involve any illegal activity. It doesn't compare to my DMT experiences, let's say, but there, that would be something that would be interesting to consider. But what I would say is, what I'm trying to highlight here, and actually maybe I should point this out, maybe this isn't necessarily, or what I'm trying to point out is not necessarily about any entity encounter, but the entity encounter where someone is saying, this other is so transcendentally other, it has changed my worldview. And I'm not sure if that is associated with sleep paralysis, because like you say, it's often a demon or something that has this cultural background. Whereas for McKenna, for example, he said he was so interested in DMT because he could find nothing in art or culture or religion that touched the weirdness or the transcendental otherness that he encountered. But I think that's actually a really interesting thing. I'll think more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the fascinating talk. I'm thinking about Jules Evans's recent post about European folklore and that as a map for thinking about these entity encounters. So basically what Jules is proposing, that regardless of the ontological status of these entities, folklore often describes beings that have their own sort of morality. So you cannot expect that they're benevolent or malevolent in the regular sense. They might be very benevolent until you cross some arbitrary or to you arbitrary line, after which they like inflict horrific punishments on you. And whether or not such entities actually exist, but that's something that happens in psychedelic experiences. I was actually surprised by the mention in the study you referred to about people describing them as mostly benevolent. Of course, yeah, maybe mostly with DMT, that's true, but also people so often describe experiences with like horrifying punishments or, yeah. What do you think about that folklore model or Jules's idea?
Yes, that study does also mention malevolent experiences, people being ripped apart. Rick Strassman's volunteers, many of them encountered malevolent entities. And also particularly about the folklore. So McKenna was very interested in Celtic folklore. He was Irish American. I'm Irish. There is this like trickster archetype is almost the one. It's good, bad. It's more like they like to play. And again, McKenna does characterize them like this as well. So I think that's a really good point that they're, and even the shamanic traditions as well, is like, it's as if these entities have their own agenda, their own either morality or amorality. So yes, and I think that maybe, for example, in Ireland, there's like, a lot of like fairy stories are about people like falling into the fairy world and being trapped there for like an inordinate amount of time and this kind of thing. Or you also think about like fables that are about people being given the opportunity to make wishes by some entity, but they get granted in this like tricky way that turns against the person. So yes, there does seem to be this kind of folk tradition of like, don't just trust an entity because it appears to you, you know, and yes, to have your wits about you. But equally, I mean, again, you would say this about humans, right? I mean, you don't just trust any human. And again, being Irish, we learned that like from day one as well. But certainly the folklore traditions do seem to enshrine this, but also still the weirdness, the otherness, is not emphasized. And one other thing that I would point out that I didn't mention in this is that a lot of people who go through these experiences, especially if they see it as an initiatory path, find that whatever model they use works up to a certain point, and then it breaks down, and then they have to get a new model, and then they go further, and then that model breaks down, and that this other seems to continue to recede no matter what. So it defies encapsulation by any model or metaphor, which again you might even consider part of that trickster archetype. That's what I was. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It's again, like there's so many different thought-provoking things today. I was thinking about unitive and then relational experiences. Have you come across those both coexisting, where someone would be like, well, there's an entity, but that entity is me, and also I am that entity, that there's this kind of like both happening simultaneously?
That's a brilliant question. Okay, so my primary topic of research is Aleister Crowley and Aleister Crowley's system of magic. And so those mystical and meditative practices exist in parallel to the magical practices. And Crowley, in his terminology, he calls it the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. And it's both this union with the angel, but also a relation with the angel. So there's that. There's also the thing about these peak experiences is that they seem to have this paradoxical thing where it is both other and self. So in some sense, it can be a part of the experience that the person recognizes it as something that they are united with, but for whatever reason in this mode of the experience, they are related to it. But I wouldn't make actually the hard and fast rule that they are two different things, rather than two different ways of looking at the same thing, or two different ways for people to experience the same type of thing.
Thank you very much.
Let's thank Patrick once more.